I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're sharpening our swords and preparing for judgment, as I rank the Soulsborne games by difficulty. That's right, easiest to hardest. This will perhaps be the most subjective list I have ever done on this channel, as everybody has a completely different perspective on difficulty. What order you played the games in, what aspects of the games you naturally gravitate towards, playstyle, and whether you use everything the game offers. I want to see your thoughts on this topic because there is genuinely, and I want to stress this, there is genuinely no wrong answer here. For my rankings, I'll go into why I think people find each game difficult and then either agree or refute those points with my own experience or thoughts. It should be a lot of fun. And I've got a few, choice selections, shall we say? Some spicy takes, if you will. I'm treating this more like a stream of consciousness ranking. A lot of my thoughts aren't going to flow together beautifully, but I'm trying to condense difficulty into easy to understand rankings, and that was my first mistake. So let's jump right in. All 7 Soulsborne games, easiest to hardest, ranked. And let me know your easiest and hardest Soulsborne game down below. I went back and forth on what I consider to be the easiest Souls game. After all, they're all difficult in their own unique ways, but for me, it's Demon's Souls, the original game developed by From Software that first brought this level of challenge into our lives. So first things first, what's difficult about Demon's Souls? The most obvious aspect of the game that I think many players, including myself, struggled with is world tendency. In Demon's Souls, depending on various player actions, your world can shift to either pure white or pure black tendency. If you lean more towards white, enemies become easier, while if you lean more towards black, they're a lot harder. There's more to it than that, but for the purposes of difficulty, the enemy changes are the most important feature. For new players who didn't research Demon's Souls, they wouldn't know that dying in human form will shift your tendency to black, and I did not realize this on my first playthrough, and almost got softlocked in 4-2 when I hit pure black tendency and found myself getting absolutely demolished by the rolling skeletons on the cliffside. Moments like this make Demon's Souls feel oppressive and brutal, but with a little research, it's very easy to avoid black world tendency altogether. Just wear the Cling Ring, suicide in the Nexus each time you turn human, and you never have to worry about going black. Demon's Souls also has the most broken healing system. In this game, you use a variety of different consumable grasses to heal, and you can carry quite a lot of them to a ridiculous degree. A little bit of farming and a few purchases from certain merchants, and you'll never run out of healing ever again. This makes exploring levels a cakewalk because you never have that "oh no, I'm out of Estus" moment from the later games. The level design can be a bit brutal at times, as you don't ever get checkpoints. Every time you die, you restart from that level's archstone, and unless you found a hidden shortcut, which is only available in certain levels, you're doing a lot of backtracking constantly. Levels like 3-1 and 4-1 can be tedious to run back through, especially if you're having to re-kill a ton of enemies with each attempt. But as said, the healing aspect of this game offsets this difficulty tremendously, so once you know a path through the level, you should be able to reach it again without much hassle. The bosses are also a very mixed bag. They skew towards the easier end of the difficulty scale, with a lot of fights where once you know their secret per se, you can blitz through them. Leechmonger being weak to fire, the Adjudicator having a wound you can attack, Fool's Idol having a different sorcery to her clones, and the main archdemons follow this trend too. Stealth Ballista Simulator, fight an online player or computer AI, the Storm Ruler Storm King, and killing Estrella's husbando. I really like Demon's Souls more than I thought I would, but the difficulty here comes from a lack of research, from the game failing to explain its mechanics. But on the flip side, it has one of the best opening levels in the series, 1-1, which shows so many different enemy setups you'll face in all of these games. And it's got a good progression curve that levels out towards the end of your playthrough. No difficulty spikes outside of the Flame Lurker boss fight. If only the healing system wasn't so broken, maybe it would have actually scored higher on this list. Now for the most controversial take on this list, I think the next easiest game after Demon's Souls is the most recent From Software title, Elden Ring. The game that broke through to the masses and entered the mainstream in a major way. There's a reason why so many people gravitated towards this experience. Elden Ring may have one of the more complicated RPG systems of the Soulsborne games, with so much variety to choose from and so many different moves and mechanics to learn, which some could say makes the game more difficult. But you can also argue the opposite. Elden Ring is the one game in this franchise that gives you unlimited freedom on how you tackle the challenges in front of you. Because you have the ability to go wherever you want, whenever you want, the moment you step out into Limgrave. So, do you want to explore the open world, take down enemy camps, find forts across the lands between, maybe even sneak into Caelid or Liurnia early so you can get some new talismans, spells, weapons, and armor? It's a game that encourages you to forge your own path, and while you are more likely to run into locations that are designed for players above your current level, there's always somewhere else you can then go that is more designed around your current skills. It's so easy to break this game, so easy to get a build that decimates bosses and neutralizes any threats coming your way. And if you're a more casual player, you've got the usual summon feature where you can bring friends into your world to help you out in dungeons and at certain bosses. You've got Spirit Ashes where you can level up and summon to help draw aggro in fights and give you a better chance of success. There's a reason why the Mimic tier Spirit Ash was considered so broken by the community at launch. The challenge from Elden Ring comes from the bosses, because the areas and the legacy dungeons and the level design is so good, you'll find yourself flowing through them without a terrible amount of issue, and there's enough sights of grace in every level that you never feel like you're going too long without finding one. Maybe you'll panic if you run into a stray Crucible Knight or a field boss you weren't expecting, but those seem to be few and far between. Outside of the last 25% of the game where the bosses become a lot tougher and you need at least 50 vigor to stand a remote chance, the difficulty curve is entirely what you make of it. The hardest challenges in Elden Ring are entirely optional after all. If we're judging Elden Ring without spirit summons and no abusing broken builds, then maybe it's a harder game, but that isn't what we're ranking here. That's the equivalent of ranking a Pokemon game's difficulty due to a Nuzlocke being hard. It's not the experience a majority of players will have. Let me know if you agree with me down below. Shall we continue with the hot takes? At number 5, we have Dark Souls 3. Yes, I personally think Dark Souls 3 is an easier game than its two prequels, and let me explain why. So the main difficulty of Dark Souls 3 definitely comes from the fact that this is the first Souls game where enemies and the player move at a similar, fast-paced speed. It's taking tips from Bloodborne, but without that game's focus on player aggression, while keeping the aggression of the enemies to create a more balanced style of play. And I used to think, oh, it's faster combat, so it must be harder combat. But I found that it's easier for me to dodge attacks, face down bosses, rush through areas in Dark Souls 3 compared to the other games. It takes you down a very linear path through the world. There's tons of optional places to explore in every zone, so you're always finding new equipment and items, and it feels like for every difficult enemy, there's 100 fodder enemies that get cut up like a hot knife through butter. I find this game starts off hard, mellows out towards the middle, and then ramps the difficulty up again at the end, which is a weird gradient to think about, but works for the experience 3 is going for. It has those quality of life features that come from being the third game in a series, improved controls, a more convenient hub with all the fixins, and a large scope of build variety compared to the past two games. The bosses are some of the toughest in the series, but the amount of them that can be simply rolled through is astounding. And as someone who tends to panic roll in Soulsborne games, I find Dark Souls 3 to be extremely forgiving towards my tendency. I've died more in Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 than I ever did in Dark Souls 3. It benefits from being a more up-to-date From Software title, as it's easier to grasp with that 8-directional rolling compared to those tankier controls of past games. Basically, players can acclimate easier because Dark Souls 3 uses a more industry-standard control scheme. This will be the game people are most mixed on, because I'm sure if you started with Dark Souls 3, this was a brutal difficulty curve to overcome, but when compared to the rest of the pack, I actually think Dark Souls 3's base game is a walk in the park without many difficult challenges, outside of the optional fights, of course. It's not until the DLC that we really get some technically difficult areas and bosses, but does me dying to the Dregheap Angels 40 times constitute the whole game being considered hard? Does the Ringed City being spammed with, in my opinion, awful enemy placement constitute the whole game being considered hard? I think that answer is different depending on who you talk to, but for me, that answer would be a no. Happy holidays, viewers! I am trying to reach 20,000 subscribers on this channel by the summer of 2024, and I know we can do it. See how many of you guys aren't subscribed right now? We need to fix that. So be sure to parry that subscribe button to stay up to date on all of my future gaming content. Back to the video. In the middle of the pack, we have the original Dark Souls, and this is the game that no doubt will have the most split from my audience, because I've seen every opinion under the sun. This game is the most difficult in the world. Nay, it's the easiest game in the series, because the combat hasn't been molded into what we've got today. For me, the first playthrough of Dark Souls was absolutely brutal. I found myself dying constantly throughout Lordran, both from bosses and enemies alike. I actually think in terms of area design, it's got some of the tougher locations to explore in the series. Outer Anor Londo with the rooftop rafters and those archers. Sen's Fortress and the sheer variety of traps I can only avoid nowadays because I'm not a newcomer. Tomb of the Giants and its darkness and those dangerous enemies that lurk below. Channelers buffing regular enemies to make them two-shot you in the Duke's Archives. Blighttown. I can point out difficult moments from every level, and while the boss roster is arguably one of the easiest in the series, I'll give you that, there's one aspect of Dark Souls that everybody underestimates, and that is the controls. Dark Souls 1 is clunky, but in a nice way, especially compared to Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring. It's like you're dealing with tank controls, and the sluggish system puts this game at odds with a lot of gamers out there. I've seen countless tweets and comments about people going back to older games and not being able to handle them because of, well, how they handle. And this is just gaming in general, not specifically Soulsborne, but in my recent Dark Souls community boss ranking video, I noted that there were many comments from people who have played Elden Ring, but then went back to Dark Souls 1 and found themselves struggling. I may have perfected my playthroughs of Dark Souls now after years of practice and understanding the interconnected world design and how the dodging works and how powerful shields are, but I take that information for granted, and I think if I gave someone Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 3, they'd complete 3 long before they complete 1. Perhaps the biggest challenge of all to a new player though is navigating the world. We've had countless stories of new chosen undead running into the catacombs skeletons, getting wrecked, and quitting the game. And then I recall there's no warping for the first half, and how brutal that first ever visit down to Blighttown can really be, and then how it's not always clear where you need to go, and that lack of linearity is the opposite of Dark Souls 3, and for me, is what personally seals the deal of Dark Souls being the tougher game. Because unlike Elden Ring, which also has a complete lack of linearity, it's very easy to make genuine wrong decisions in Dark Souls. Decisions that you can't come back from without a lot of work. Finding yourself trapped in Tomb of the Giants, unable to warp out, getting cursed by a basilisk or even Seath in the late game and having your health permanently halved until you fix the status. However, on the flip side, Dark Souls still is able to invite new players with some flexible systems that make the game easier to manage. You've got the healing system, where you can kindle bonfires to increase their healing output. In modern Souls games, you have a set amount of Estus, while here, once you've beaten Pinwheel, you can get up to 20 flasks per bonfire, which sounds absolutely broken, because it is. And you're able to level up from anywhere you want, no need to return to a hub and talk to a maiden, so if you're truly stuck somewhere and you need to get stronger, you can just farm souls from basic enemies nearby and bolster yourself before taking on the game's next challenge. Then there's the usual summons, which while optional, certainly provide help to newer players or those wanting to experience jolly cooperation. I'm not trying to say that Dark Souls is the hardest game ever made like all of those news articles, I just know that I had to put a lot more time into learning Dark Souls 1 because of the more deliberate control scheme over Dark Souls 3. Coming in third place, we have Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin. I'd love to rank base game Dark Souls 2, but I don't have a copy of it anymore, and it's been years since I last played it. Plus, Scholar is the version From Software is forcing on us, so we kind of have to deal with it, you know? I think of all the From Software games, Scholar of the First Sin is the one that hates the player the most. Whether you take that as a compliment or an insult, though, is entirely down to each player. They revamped a lot of enemy placement and systems while updating this game, and it shows. Because so many enemies in every area are placed in very bullshit locations. More enemies are spammed across the game in spots they don't need to be, it feels like a Kaizo hack. Why are there so many Alon Knights in the first area of the Iron Keep, and why do they all aggro almost immediately? In my opinion, there's no point in enemy placement if they're going to just rush you regardless. Why have we populated Hyde's Tower of Flame with all the Hyde Knights? I realize that sounds like a dumb complaint given the literal Hyde Knights are now in an area called Hyde and you'd think that's good, but context. They were some of the toughest early game enemies in base Dark Souls 2, and were placed throughout the world as optional tests should you choose to attack them. They're some of the first enemies I remember struggling against back in 2014, but now they're just littered around Hyde's Tower of Flame without a care until you kill the Dragon Rider, which then they all become aggroed, making attempts to reach the old Dragon Slayer boss a complete nuisance if you did the Dragon Rider boss first. And because they're all consolidated into one area, they become less memorable to new players who aren't going to think twice about them once they're finished. Enemies hit hard in this game, and your movement is the slowest in the series. It's like trudging through sludge with every dodge, and if you're a new player, you won't know to level up adaptability. You're just going to suffer not knowing that the game has a literal stat you need to level just to get Dark Souls 1 style iframe dodging. Sure, you can stock up on life gems, but they, as well as the Estus, take time to use, and health regeneration can be extremely slow in the early game, meaning you'll heal, but then probably take a hit that kills you anyway. And death punishes you because of this game's hollowing system. While not as brutal initially as Demon's Souls' World tendency, I think the idea of losing more and more base HP can be a dangerous, slippery slope if you have a player that's never played before, getting stuck in the first area. Maybe they run out of human effigies and now they can't revive their health bar to full and enemies are 2 or 3-shotting them. It just doesn't sound fun, does it? I can handle this mechanic as an experienced player now, but by god, a few years ago when I attempted the DS2 Platinum, which I did get by the way, I was miserable. Every level feels like Sen's Fortress. It's so hard to trust anything in this game, and it just gets a little exhausting after a while. The bosses are easy at least, but there's so many of them that it can be overwhelming in its own way. This was my first Souls game back in 2014, and I thought dying so much was normal, but even all these years later, I still die just as much in Dark Souls 2, and I chalk that up to the game being so vastly different to every other game in the series that your muscle memory just doesn't translate. And that's also ignoring how obtuse some of the exploration in this game is. Sure, getting to Lost Sinner is a breeze, and the path to the Iron Keep is fairly easy to find. However, had I not had a friend tell me back in the day about the gutter when I first got the game, I probably wouldn't have thought to drop down the Majula hole. And how on earth were you supposed to figure out how to reach the Giant Lord after completing the Dragon Area? It feels like such a random, arbitrary thing before you can do the Throne of Want. Not to mention some extremely brutal DLCs. What I find funny is that the DLCs came before Scholar of the First Sin released, so when developing this new version of the game, they purposefully tried to match the base game areas up with the difficulty and style of the DLCs. Whether it worked or not is up to you to judge, but I genuinely think it made the game much harder as a result. I think the DLCs were perfect in terms of their difficulty. It made sense. They were endgame areas to explore. Having that same style of enemy placement in Forest of the Fallen Giants? That being said, there are a couple of major plus points when it comes to 2 that keep it in 3rd place. It's very easy to level up, bosses give a surprisingly large amount of souls when killed, and as long as you immediately go and level up following each boss fight or area, you'll be in the 100s by the time you reach Drangleic Castle for the first time. Overleveling can be fun, and combine that with an easy respec option as long as you have a soul vessel, and you're in good hands. Some builds can also be very broken. Take my penchant for bonk builds that allows me to flatten just about any enemy with a heavy strength weapon. Very satisfying, but I have heard that dexterity is just as good. Then there's the open-ended nature of the first half of the game. It does the opposite of Dark Souls 1 by giving you all these paths and then converging in the last third of the experience, which means you can go down any path and likely find success or somewhere to explore. Just maybe have a guide that tells you how to get to each area. Of the traditional Souls games, for me, Dark Souls 2 is always going to be the hardest, and it'll have a fond place in my heart. But maybe we should get onto those non-traditional Souls games then, shall we? And number 2, we have the gothic horror of Bloodborne. Unlike prior entries where it's often a cat and mouse game of who lets down their defenses first, Bloodborne takes a completely aggressive approach to its combat, because to be quite frank with you all, the level design isn't any crazier than your average Soulsborne game. It is 100% the combat that launches Bloodborne this high on the list. What other game has to chokehold their players with an early game boss that forces them to learn to play the game the way the developers intended? Father Gascoigne is specifically designed to curate all the skills picked up in Central Yharnam so that you've adapted to the aggressive, no-holds-barred nature of Bloodborne's combat. You want to hit your opponent, you want to dodge inwards, you want to keep up the relentless attacks, time some good gun parries, get that visceral, and keep it up, sport. And for many players, this is so difficult to adapt to because they're so used to holding up a shield, dodging away from enemies, taking on creatures one at a time, and that is ruined so early on in Bloodborne when your first major challenge is an entire street filled with a mob of Yharnamites. No matter how you approach, you will always aggro multiple enemies, and you'll have to learn to crowd control with your trick weapon. Luckily, said trick weapons having multiple forms means there's often a variant that does well against crowds. The spin to win from the Hunter's Axe, the threaded cane's whip, etc, etc. Dodging backwards doesn't work anymore, as bosses with guns will just fire them at you, catching you in said dodge. Other bosses and enemies have lunging attacks that purposefully go past the player, designed to catch anyone who dodges back instead of forwards. The rally system incentivizes you to keep attacking so you can regain health. You're always being pushed ahead, and no shields. I think Bloodborne works best by keeping crowd fights to very basic enemies. The moment you've got 3 to 4 actually dangerous foes piling on top of you, it can be tough to find a safe space to get out of the situation. There's a reason why 1v1 hunter fights are my favorite, they're so frenetic and exciting, or why boss fights get all the attention because it is just you versus the boss. Ludwig, Maria, Orphan, Gascoigne, Gehrman, etc. Another aspect of Bloodborne that people like to mention is the pain of needing to farm for blood vials if you truly get stuck on a difficult to defeat boss. In my first playthrough, I got so stuck I had to run around Central Yharnam for genuine hours farming blood vials so I could have another crack at the fights. I understand why they went with this healing mechanic, it fits Bloodborne's combat flow better than Estus would, but you could have made blood vials a bit less expensive in the Hunter's Dream. It's not like Demon Souls where you can hoard a billion healing items every time you leave, you always start with 20 when you spawn at any given lamp. Bloodborne's learning curve is fun because it doesn't allow you to bring skills from prior games into this one, but once the combat clicks, it becomes one of the easier games in the series to me. You could say that about every game on today's list though, so focusing on that pre-click and what most people will experience, I think that's what got it to number 2. But who am I kidding? At number 1, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is the most demanding From Software Soulsborne title on the market, to the point where you can make the very fair case that it's not a Soulsborne title, it just has bosses and tight level design like a Souls game. Sekiro's combat is completely unique, there's nothing like it in the rest of Souls as it relies heavily on one aspect of FromSoft's games that many players won't have even interacted with: the humble parry. In Sekiro, you and your opponents have a posture meter, and your goal in battle is to either do health damage or do posture damage by deflecting attacks. You can get a perfect deflect by pressing the deflect button at the right time during an attack, and this creates a battle flow that many have called a rhythm action game. Because yes, Sekiro is a rhythm game. Yeah, it has action exploration and fun vertical levels that let you fuck around with a grappling hook, but every enemy encounter is designed in a way where you can perfect parry most every attack. There are perilous instances where you might have to unlock and Mikiri counter a thrust, maybe jump over a perilous attack, or back away from a grab or two, but more than any other game in the series, you either learn to deflect attacks or you don't beat Sekiro. Genichiro Ashina is a blatant barrier near the mid-game that repels any player who attempts to cheese his fight. He's just too strong, and the only way to win is to read his combos, block accordingly, damage that posture, and strike. You can stealth most enemies in regular levels, which is pretty easy, and makes some encounters less difficult, but Sekiro, even more so than Bloodborne, is a game that relies on 1v1 battles to make the game feel fluid. It's why with many mini-bosses, you'll have to whittle down their lackeys before making any contact with the big guys themselves, otherwise you'll be overwhelmed. And even then, every enemy, mini-boss, and boss has insanely detailed movesets that put the rest of the series to shame, and you're expected to learn each and every one of them. You can make the game easier with shinobi prosthetics and upgrade paths, skill trees, experience, and the like, but the game will ultimately funnel you down one playstyle. There's no magic, there's no ranged DPS. You're a melee shinobi and you have to accept that. It's not an RPG like Elden Ring that lets you play how you want. Each enemy has specific weaknesses. Some bosses have very specific weaknesses to specific shinobi tools. You just have to figure it out. I don't think anybody will disagree with me on this top pick, and for my money, Sekiro was the toughest game to complete of the lot. But once the combat clicks, it clicks even better than Bloodborne, and becomes a real dance that you can master that just takes so much time. The most difficult Soulsborne game is, without a doubt, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. And that's my list. My thoughts weren't as focused writing this script, I won't lie, so I'd love to hear what your thoughts are down below. Be sure to parry that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of my future videos on the channel. My socials are on screen now, feel free to follow where you feel comfortable. I recommend my Twitter, my Blue Sky, or my Discord, whatever you guys enjoy. And a massive shout out to my patrons over on Patreon for supporting me for another month. You guys are amazing. I'll see you guys next time. Adios.